Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Janice Kane, and just in case you don't know who I am the founder of Custom College Visits. Brief introduction, we work with families to help them plan their college visits. Since the pandemic started, we've been offering virtual visits in addition to our on-campus visits, and we've been helping students sift through the many virtual online offerings to help them find the ones that serve them best. No matter whether we're working with students on-campus visits or virtual visits, our goal behind them is for them to come away with a good feel of the campuses that they visit so that they can make better decisions in their college search process. And we do that not just by having them do the college campus tours and the admissions information sessions, but we also work with them to help them plan personalized one-on-one on-campus meetings with current students, faculty members, and other staff members that they might be interested in that suit their needs. So that basically they do come away with as much of a feel, even though they may not be on campus. One of the other areas that's been very affected by the pandemic, in addition to college visits, is the area of college testing. So I'm pleased to have with me today Steven Brachman with Sanderson Test Prep, who is going to talk to us about college testing and prep in this area, in this environment since the pandemic started. So Steve, if you'd like to chat for just a few minutes about Sanderson Test Prep and maybe a bit about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. So thank you, Janice. So like Janice said, my first name is Steven. My name is Steven Brachman, and I'm with a boutique test prep firm known as Sanderson Test Prep down here in South Florida. Sanderson Test Prep's been around for about 10 years now. We founded in 2011. And most of our focus up until this year, historically, has been on pre-college testing, like the SAT and the ACT. So this year, post-corona, during the pandemic, has been quite different. So anyone who is looking to enter college starting in September of 21 is now, in some instances, happy because they're the benefactor of a largely test-optional environment for college admissions. That test optional environment is a new one this year. There had been, of course, many liberal arts colleges in the past that had been test optional, but it's never before been the case that the Ivies have gone test optional, or that really just about everyone has gone test optional. So let's first talk about what that means. Janice, do you want me to fire this back to you before I get into this?
Yeah, we can start, that's fine. I mean, basically that's where we were going to start.
Yeah.
My first question would be basically if you could give us a little bit of an overview of where we are now. And, I guess, from where it looks like you're coming from where we were to where we are now and how that's changed. And maybe you can talk about that and what it looks like for this period for those that are applying now, and
right. Right.
Maybe
okay. So yes, we're in a different environment this year. All right. And what test optional really implies is that whereby in the past an SAT or an ACT score was really going to be a bit of a linchpin in determining someone's admission ability, or they're getting an acceptance letter. This year it's less important. All right. But it's not meaningless, all right? And so students are in a unique position. If someone's a motivated student, if they're a good student to begin with, and they're likely to do well on the SAT or the ACT, they should still take the test, all right? It's the availability of these exams that has inspired the college community to largely go test optional, because it's just simply not that easy for everyone to gain access to the opportunity to take a test. So earlier in the spring, when the virus first hit, you had SAT and ACT cancellations across the board. More recently, you've had attempts at the tests being administered, but they're very location dependent. So depending on geographically, which state someone is looking to take the test in, and then even more locally, whether the schools that are administering the tests will be open on the day of the scheduled exam. And sometimes that goes down to the wire. So because of the variability in availability of the exam, it's test optional. So what does it mean? It means that if a student is motivated and can book an exam and is lucky enough that the test center is open that day, they sit for the exam and it can enhance their candidacy on an application. All right. What's also at play is money. Schools parcel out a certain amount of scholarship award each and every year. And so if someone's going to do well on an SAT, it's going to enhance their probability of getting thousands of dollars per year in a tuition award. And that's meaningful. All right. So if we're in a test optional environment like we are here for the next year, and in many cases 2 and sometimes even 3 years, there's still scholarship money at play in addition to an acceptance, enhancing the probability of an acceptance. All right. Now, California schools who really set the pace, the California public school system of colleges is what I'm referring to here. They were the ones that really set the pace of adopting the SAT back in the 60s, right? The SAT was actually implemented back in the late 20s, didn't really gain traction for a while. But by the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, you had 800,000 people taking the test a year. What we had prior to COVID, by the way, between the SAT and the ACT, you had 4 million kids taking a test every year. We have a mere fraction of that now. All right. So we're test optional on the way to test blind. California made the announcement to go test blind starting with the academic year of 2023, meaning that the tests wouldn't even be used to determine scholarship money. Not only would they not be used to lever acceptances, but also scholarship money. So, one can make a case that given the accelerating environment of COVID-19 in terms of accelerating anything and everything into the direction that it may have been moving in prior to the pandemic, that the SAT and college standardized tests could be on their way out. All right. And that's something that's not clearly determined as of yet, but it's something that we may be looking back on 2 years from now or 3 years from now with greater certainty. So while it's still test optional, there is an opportunity to leverage strong academic ability, put up a nice score, include it in an application, and maybe get some scholarship money. All right. For those students who are less motivated, less inclined, it's a boon. It's playing hooky. You don't have to prepare for the SAT. And if it's not something that one was disposed toward in the beginning, fine. If someone is a slightly better student, it's an opportunity given the prevailing academic environment in high school with a lot of online classes and a little, less structure, fewer demands, fewer extracurricular activities to actually put that time and academic energy toward an SAT. So the long and short answer is it's still valuable to take an SAT or an ACT. It can help you get into school, can help you get scholarship money. But if you're not predisposed to doing well, then it's an opportunity to just relax and not bother, because you can still apply to schools without an SAT, but you're going to want to make sure that the other legs of your candidacy are strong. Okay. The fact that schools are not requiring SATs does not mean that they're going soft on acceptances. It just means that they're not requiring SATs.
Right. And along those lines, one of the questions that I had come in that somebody asked was they wanted to hear their thoughts on current seniors who are not able to take the SAT and the ACT. So basically, that's somewhat of what you're talking about. Just to sort of maybe elaborate on that a little bit, was to talk about how do they go about sort of strengthening the other areas of their application, or what does that mean, so to speak, to strengthen those other areas of their application, because they don't have that option they don't even have that choice of saying, well,
I mean, if somebody's a rising senior, it's already late in the game, and it's an excellent question. And it really, it certainly applies to rising seniors. It applies to juniors too, in fact. Okay. So, a standardized test is not the only leg that an application stands on, right? And so if you want to think about it as having really 4 legs, okay? So the test is a differentiator that is, designed to be a level playing field for everybody, right? Because everybody's coming from different geographies, different public schools, different private schools, different backgrounds and all that. So that was the purpose of the test in the first place. So if the test gets removed from the equation, it's one of 4 legs. The other legs are going to be the academic performance, right? The grade point average, and also what classes that student is taking or has taken. So if you're a rising senior, a lot of that's already established. Your grade point is relatively established, and the courses that you've taken are relatively established, right? But if you can still stack it with some advanced classes, seniors are going to have senioritis. They might not want to be bothering with AP physics in their second semester senior year. But what schools are going to be looking at in the absence of test scores are grade point average and the difficulty of classes. So if you're younger than a senior, you do want to be thinking in terms of trying to get into honors classes and taking the AP classes because you're going to look that much better, right? Apart from that, you have extracurricular activities and how you're spending your summers, So, community involvement is always nice. And at a younger age, demonstrating an ability to volunteer to something that actually matters to you, that you can reference in an essay, that's consistent with your background and your track record and your interests, rather than just checking a box off in a last-minute attempt to make things look good for the application. It's not going to fly when it's just an attempt to look good. But if there's context to it and you provide an opportunity to show contribution, right? Because as students get older, I work with a lot of graduate students as well. And, you want to be able to show not just what you're going to get from a school, but what you're going to give to the school. And what schools are looking to do when they're assembling a class, they're looking for diversity. There's a velvet rope. You can think of it as being a nightclub where they want a variety of people in that night. So a school's going to want a variety of people in that year, right? And when you differentiate yourself through diversity and also contribution, and younger people tend to be less disposed to contribution than people who are slightly older, all right? We may not rid ourselves of our purely selfish mindset until we get a little bit older, or of our largely selfish mindset. So if a younger person trying to get into college can show that they're giving to the situation contextually, and they can write about it in their essay a little, it doesn't have to be the central focus, that's going to help, all right? So contribution, extracurrics, how somebody has spent their summers, right? And then the essays, all right? The essays have always mattered, and you can make a very viable case that essays matter more now than ever. Right. And so you want to be structuring the story properly. And part of that, given the uniqueness of 2020, is talking about how you've been using the COVID downtime as live time and how you've been productive now. And if there's a senior and, just hasn't been doing it, it's not too late, all right? And you find a way to contribute during COVID, that's worth something, all right? And so the essays are going to matter, and the recommendations are going to matter, a little bit more, all right? So when we remove the standardized test out of the equation, we want to strengthen the subjective elements of an application, and that's what's got to be done, because after that, what's left,
Right. And for seniors who have, who basically were thrust into this situation, their second semester last year, and have had to figure out maybe what their community service might look like, or their other summer plans, keep in mind that schools are also keeping that in mind. Schools understand, they are going to understand what the situation is, and will look at it with a more understanding eye to what's happened and what's been available and what kids are trying to do or have tried to do based on the situation with the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, to like from a business standpoint, to point out, because I know a lot of students are going to be nervous, and rightfully so, but the odds are not stacked against students in actuality. If anything, schools are very concerned. They're very unanswered. There's a lot of uncertainty and many unanswerable questions right now. And schools are concerned. They're running businesses. They're selling seats to class still. All right. And obviously, the more desirable schools are going to have less of a business concern or financial concern. But there are plenty of good schools. I'm not going to name any, but there are those that have that are facing financial pressure, and they are going to want to have more applicants, not fewer, and they're going to want to be granting more acceptances to fill the class. And this is something that's going to spell out, I think, not just this year. It's going to take time to fill out, but it's also one of the variables that speak to the possibility of standardized college tests like the SAT and ACT potentially dying off, you know, over the next 3 years or so. Because once a school does not accept the tests and gets a greater influx of applications and is able to meet their business goals, it's going to be a little harder for them to go back and require the test, knowing that it's going to cut into their applicant pool. So, you know, we really are in the early stages of a potential sea change here. But the tests are not yet irrelevant. And as I indicated earlier, they still matter. For those who really care, they matter, and you can benefit from them.
And I think also it's going to be interesting to see how things fall out for the schools, how they see it fall out over this season and next season. And that will help them make the decision about how they will move forward beyond that, I think. So we'll see. It's, you know, it's a lot is up in the air for everybody, I think.
Yeah.
So moving along a little bit, Steve. So let's say students, let's look at juniors more than anybody, I would guess, juniors. And if they can, and they decide they want to take the tests, and that they are accessible, when should they take those tests?
Okay, so if you're a junior, now is a sweet time to take the test for the first time between now and the end of the year. With the thought in mind that one may not be one and done, maybe taking it more than once. So traditionally, a lot of rising juniors will take it around this time of year, October, November, December, either exam, right? Because they each give their scheduled dates during this fourth quarter, with the thought in mind that, again, they may take it again in the spring, right? So, you know, you can super score your sections on the SAT. So you may do well on quant one time and not as strongly on verbal. And then maybe that can reverse itself in the spring. Plenty of good students take the SAT 2 or 3 times. So the time frame for doing it, if you're a rising senior and you still want to take it, is now. If you're a junior, you can take it now. And then, you know, a lot of juniors may not take it now, and they'll take it in the spring, and that's fine too. You got to figure that logistically, it's going to be easier to take it in the spring. So given the pandemic and such, it's not always so easy. You have a lot of students traveling to other states.
Right.
Exam.
Right.
So, you know, it's really a personal decision about whether or not to take it this quarter. Hopefully things are easier by March, you know, and then all hands on deck for March, you know, taking it in the spring.
Great. And if they decide to take the test, and how do they decide whether to take the ACT or the SAT?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Janice. I mean, it's really a matter, it's subjective, it's a matter of personal preference, right? A lot of people will sort of lead off thinking they're going to take the SAT. The best way and the most efficient way to figure that out is to take a practice test of each. All right. And we're not incredibly concerned with the score of each. And you can look up online how the scores compare between the ACT and the SAT. That's easy to see, score comparison chart. But you want to get a feel by taking at least one of each. The College Board has books out. They run the SAT, the College Board. They have books that include 10 SATs. You can certainly find practice SATs online for free. It's really using online resources to gauge which one you feel more comfortable with. There's a certain amount of similarity between the two. The ACT is going to have some science-based questions that the SAT won't have a science section, so to speak. But it's really feel. And as well, we have a little something at Sanderson Test Prep. If you go to sandersontestprep.com, and students avail themselves of this all the time. You create a free academic profile. Then once we have you in our system, Then you can take an assessment that we offer for $75, I think it is, and it'll save you time. And in doing that assessment, you'll be able to conclude which test to start with. It's not a terrible idea. It's a good idea because it can save you time. The whole point of test prep in general, like I've been in the test prep business since 1997. So I taught at Kaplan for 6 years, and, kind of know the business a little bit by this point after, well over 15 years of devoting myself to test prep. You don't want to waste time. The whole point of test prep is to save time and do well on the exam, get into the schools that you're targeting, and maybe even get a return on investment once you get some scholarship money. Nobody's going to care about investing $2,000 in test prep if they wind up getting $20,000 in scholarship money. All right. So, that's part of the equation. And, if you don't get scholarship money, not everybody does. You still get into the schools you want. It's worth it. Right. And if you do it in a time efficient manner. Right. So taking an assessment is a good idea because nobody wants to study for the SAT for a month and then switch gears, because part of the idea too, with any specific test, even though the math on both tests is going to be similar, you're going to want to know your algebra and your geometry and your number properties, inequalities, exponents, and all that kind of stuff. There are still approaches to specific question types on each individual exam that won't necessarily overlap. So you take an assessment, you save yourself time so you don't have to regroup and in a sense, start over, to some degree.
Yeah, yeah. And I think basically a lot of what you're saying is also that it comes down to, for some students, it's a comfort level with a test. I think I've mentioned to you in the past how my son came home and said to me, he got done with the ACT, he did it, a trial test, and he said, I'm never taking this test. So we knew from the beginning that wasn't going to be his test. And with my daughter, it was different. She chose that test, but she kind of realized, she realized early on that, you mentioned that there's a science portion of that test. And what we found with her was that she just needed to, it was a matter of figuring out the timing of the test, because by the time she got to the science portion, she was really tired. And so how did she do that so that she could easily get to that part and still feel like she could move forward and answer all those questions without any trouble? So it's interesting. It's definitely, I think, as you were talking about, more a comfort level to a certain extent.
There's no question about it. I mean, there, what you just spoke to with your daughter, there are going to be pacing issues for different people with different aspects of the exams. And so if there's a pacing issue, it needs to be fixed. It usually will, usually with proper coaching, pacing issues go away. But if somebody's not comfortable with an exam, forget it. It's like, how's somebody going to succeed at something that they're resisting?
Right.
Yeah. So that's a decision to make relatively early on in the process.
And you started to talk a little bit about test prep. So if a student is thinking about doing that on their own, how would you recommend that they go about doing that in terms of timing, in terms of time management, how much time, lead time should they leave? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Like when I work with students, I don't have a ton of rules. I like to assess who I'm dealing with, get a sense of their personality. And then, devise strategies. But my number one rule, the only rule I have with prep, and if somebody wants to do self-test prep, never miss 2 days in a row. All right. So test prep, test prep is generally skills development. It's not like we're studying for a science test at school or even a math test at school, where we're being tested on the last 3 weeks of material or whatever. It's skills development. You want to think in terms of alertness and precision, and we get there through repetition, and we get there by seeing enough questions and doing enough practice tests in a timed environment to get that feel for endurance and also what's required of us. Because, we can practice in between practice tests in an untimed manner. The whole point of doing practice questions is to learn and is to get stuff right and to get stuff wrong. And when we get stuff wrong, we want to extract something from every question. So it's never, it's always a victory when we're practicing if we're learning something from a question. So if somebody wants to self-study, here's the answer. First, you're clear on which tests you're pursuing. Then you get the right books. You don't need a ton of books. You need two. You need one that's going to include practice tests. You need another one that's going to lay out the structure of the exam and give you a good amount of practice questions for each chapter, if you will. All right. Those you can find on Amazon. They don't take a lot of detective work. All right. You also have Khan Academy, which gives free SAT explanations and free SAT materials, which definitely is helpful. All right. So if you're going for the SAT, you go to Khan Academy, you get a College Board book of exams, and you decide when you're ready to start. You don't have to study 3 hours a day. Like, this is important. You know, everybody's got a life. Everybody's got interests and diversions. And when the SAT rolls around, particularly in a test optional environment, it's like, why are you going to punish yourself and study 4 hours a day in, day out, and give you this unreasonable expectation that you have to live up to, and then be miserable? So instead, never miss 2 days in a row. Some days you might only feel like doing a half hour. Fine. All right. Other days you'll feel like doing an hour and a half. Great. All right. What are we thinking? We're thinking consistency, steady progress, 1% or more a day. We're not looking to ace this thing inside of 5 days, but we're looking to make incremental progress every week. And if we don't miss 2 days in a row, we do. And if you know that Tuesday night you're not going to be studying, then you make sure that Monday and Wednesday you are definitely putting in a little bit of time. All right. And you get your practice tests in on the weekend. They're going to require a little bit more time commitment. All right, fine. So whether it's on a Saturday or a Sunday, you set aside a few hours and you do it under timed test conditions. Like, that's important. So notice the whole point of taking the practice test is not the curiosity of what score you're going to get. All right. Like, the very first one we take, we can treat it as a diagnostic. We get some sort of a score. That's cool. We want to know where we sit without any real preparation. Fine. All right. After that, you start doing practice questions. You start looking for patterns. It's pattern recognition. Are you not good at fractions for some reason? You know, do you have a hard time with word problems? Are you not reading things slowly and carefully enough? All right. You have to diagnose your own problems when you're doing it on your own. All right. So that can be a little more challenging, but it doesn't have to be, you know, but that's the role that a tutor plays. That's what I play. I'll look for patterns right away. I'll assess where somebody's quant ability is right away. And just by listening to them talk and how they're going through their process, you know, I'll know whether they're doing things efficiently or not. And then it's up to me to impart approaches, because the whole method of success in test prep is to have a repertoire of approaches that you can deploy on demand. And you learn these by, you know, either picking up on them on your own or somebody showing them to you and remembering them. And then you become like a jukebox. If you realize, okay, this question requires this particular approach, you remember it, and then you're there in the timed environment and you're getting the right answer in you know, the required amount of time. Doing it on your own, never miss 2 days in a row, lots of practice problems, practice tests on the weekend, every other week or every week at times, and then you're leading up to taking the test, you know, and you don't really want to take the test until you kind of have that sense that if you don't fire your best shot on test day, you're still going to get the score that you need. All right. And that's an important distinction to make. All right. So, and that's probably a question that Janice would even have. I want to give it back to her.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I guess, look, the next question would be, if students take the test, how do they decide whether or not to send their scores? And I guess the next question I have would kind of go along with that is, what's considered a good score? And how do students know whether they should retake the test? I guess, well, I guess it would be a two-part question.
Yeah. All right. So, you know, part of figuring out college is knowing what your target schools are, right? So ideally, I mean, that's something everybody should be doing. either while they're prepping or shortly before or shortly after. But before you actually take the test, you do want to have in mind where you want to go, you know, and like you might have a short list of 3 schools or 2 schools or 5 schools, you know, and do a little bit of digging and see what their range has been historically with these test scores, you know, and you want to be realistic about what schools to apply to. Or if you have these target schools, you're looking at their range, they're going to show you the low and the high, and they're going to show you the median, which is the middle term, right? And so if that's the 50 percentile, it's not the average, it's the middle term, right? Well, you want to be aiming considerably higher than the middle term, like maybe the difference between the middle and the high, so that you're in the upper quartile, right? If you're scoring in the upper 25% of the schools that you're applying to, you are definitely clearing the hurdle of the test prep leg. Okay, you don't have to get the, you know, within 5% of their high. It's nonsense, no way. But get in that upper quartile, and then hopefully you've been doing well in high school. You have good stuff to write about in your essays. You haven't been wasting your summers. You have some decent extracurriculars. You've been hopefully, you know, if you've been contributing to the community, great. You know, you get a solid recommendation or two, and then you got a really strong candidacy all of a sudden. So the bottom line about the score is, do the research in advance of the schools that you're considering and what your top choice is, and really aim to be scoring that on your practice tests, you know, at the lower end of your range on your practice tests. We're not just taking 1 or 2 practice tests heading into test day. Like, you want to take like a minimum of 6 and maybe 8 to 10. All right, because everybody has a range that gets well established. So when it comes to canceling your scores, yeah, cancel a score if it's not going to hit the upper quartile of most of the schools you're applying to. And other than that, keep it. Right?
Okay. And yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. Can you talk a little bit about the subject test? What are the subject tests? When is a good time to take them? Does it hurt to take them? Just talk a little bit about those and what they're all about.
Yeah, sure. So SAT subject tests, they're still administered, but there's a little bit of a prevailing sentiment that they're on their way out. All right. Now, that being said, they have some usefulness. All right. What they are, they're 1-hour long tests in specific subjects like physics or US history or world history. And they give a lot of them in the languages like French and Spanish and Latin and Chinese. All right. And here's what they can best be used for. All right. If you are someone who's generally a good student, but for whatever the reason, you didn't do so well in Latin or you didn't do so well in physics. All right. If you want to really demonstrate that the grade you achieved at school is not reflective of your ability, then you can make up for it with an SAT subject test. All right. So if you got a C+ or a B- in something, and you're usually like an A or an A- or a B+ student, it can make sense to take that SAT subject test. All right. The objective being to compensate for a relatively weaker performance in school. All right. Other than that, the SAT subject tests have been fading from relevance a little bit recently. All right. So I would not necessarily say, yeah, you got to take them. All right. They sort of comprise the effect that an optional essay can on an application. Right. Optional essays sometimes are included to explain away a poor semester or a poor academic performance or a poor test score. So an SAT subject test, you can think of it in those terms, whereby it can help explain away some poor academic performance and show that it wasn't really reflective of your ability.
And there's no harm in taking that. Is that correct? Because you don't have to send them, or you can choose which ones you want to send.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. They're relatively riskless. There's no harm in taking them. There's no harm in not taking them. You know, they can use up some time. Obviously, the reason not to take them might be because someone wants to, from a time management standpoint, may not want to have to prepare for one, but there's no risk in taking them or not taking them. Just think of them as tools at your disposal that can benefit your overall academic profile if you so need.
And I just had one additional question. Looking at AP scores, Should students do, or should students, do students usually send their AP scores to the schools? Perhaps now more than ever, it's important for students to send their, are the colleges looking at your AP scores when they are doing your application assessment differently, maybe this year than in the past? Do you know?
Well, I mean, the AP scores themselves have been taken under scrutiny a little bit because some of them have been given at home, and there's been
Right,
some
right.
suspicion cast on the fairness of those exams. So, with that in the mix, fewer standardized tests, we need more data points to evaluate an application.
Mhm.
So, you can make a case whereby AP scores, a strong AP score, is going to look good. It's going to help. It's part of that. What I alluded to earlier, was just in the absence of an SAT or an ACT, they're going to be looking more at grades and at the quality of somebody's academic curriculum. And if you're in AP classes and yes, take the tests, yes, forward them over, and do well. Do well on those AP tests because they can enhance.
Great, great. Well, that's all the questions I have at this point. I think we've covered quite a bit, and I thank you for that. Is there anything else at this point that you think we've missed? I do have some questions that people sent in, and we can certainly take any questions from anybody that has any. Stephen, do you think we've missed anything in
I
terms of?
don't know that we've missed much. I mean, I think we can field some questions, take the
Okay.
questions.
Okay. I do have a couple here that were sent in before. Do you foresee any schools who have gone test optional due to COVID remaining that way?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. It's really tough. I mean, you're not going to name because like if you think of Princeton, Harvard, Yale, schools like that, you would figure they'd be less likely to remain test optional over the long term. And I think that's a fair assumption to make, but we're living in uncertainty. And okay, so let's say that most of the Ivies or all the Ivies, go back to looking for those exams as one would expect. Well, what about schools like Tufts or GW or, some good schools that aren't quite Ivy? And it's really hard to make judgments about those. And I think it's going to be a business decision. I think it's going to be schools are going to evaluate how many applications they get and what their yield is and making certain they're able to fill the classes and pay the bills and pay salaries and all of professors who aren't going to want to take pay cuts. And so that's an open question. If someone is targeting really good schools, think in terms of trying to take these tests anyway. If you want to get into Harvard or Princeton, don't go test optional, take the test, and don't anticipate that you're going to be able to just sneak on, waltz on in without the test 2 or 3 years from now if you're in 9th grade or something like that. But it's an open question how it's going to trickle down.
Great, great. Okay. Okay, so the question is it a disadvantage not to submit a score even if they say it's optional? And if you're in the ballpark, is it better to submit a lower score than no score at all?
Wow. All right. So the first part, it's really, you have to ask yourself whether you're cheating yourself as a student. All right. So is it a disadvantage? If you were going to do well, but you're just feeling lazy and you don't want to be bothered, then you are disadvantaging yourself. All right. Schools are not going to know what your innate or inherent possibility would have been if you were able to put up a strong score. Right? So that's like a personal thing whereby it's almost like, well, are you giving it your best shot? All right. Now so that's to me, that's my first reaction and thought about that. All right. Then let's just say you weren't going to do so hot. All right. Is it a disadvantage? In this environment, less so. All right. That's the bottom line. If a student isn't really going to test well, don't take the test. All right. And so just enjoy the freedom of it, of being in this sort of year. And maybe you're just applying to, good schools, but not great schools, and it's not going to matter. That's okay too. I mean, what really boils down to, once someone's in college, is making the most of the experience. And we have so many good universities here in the United States that becomes a subjective thing. Is the person ready for college and to get the most out of it? You know, because you can do that almost anywhere, right? So then, should you submit a score if it's weak? All right. I think you got to be paying attention to where it fits on the expectations or on the historical expectations of the school you're applying to. So if you're below the median and you really want to go to a certain school, I would not submit it. All right. I would try to take the test again. We're not limited to one time. So take the test a second, third, fourth time. See if you can super score your sections on the SAT, and enhance your score profile. All right. If you've done that already 3 or 4 times, you know, then it still may be worth firing out an application to a school where you're below the median, right? Just because you may have, because the test is only one of 4 elements that they're really looking at. All right. I think that there tends to be a misplaced emphasis on these tests in the overall profile of an applicant. They matter, but they are not the be all end all. And that's important, you know? So if you're a little below average, well, all right, but have you done better in school? Do you have a good academic profile? Do you have good stuff to write about in your essays? You know, have you been contributing to the community? Do you come through as somebody with heart? Do you come through as somebody who's going to contribute to the class? Do you represent some diversity? You're going to get past the velvet rope. Do they have too many of the other, you know, cardboard cutout candidates already, but you are different? Then go ahead and apply.
Right. And I think it's true too that it's not, there is still that percentage of people that gets accepted that is 25% below what that middle range is.
Yes.
So,
and that's absolutely the case. And those are going to be the ones that are bringing other, you know, intangible or academically tangible elements to the table. And they're very viable. Those candidates are viable. They deserve it, even if they're in the lower quartile or 30%. Instead of, you know, 70% or 80%.
Right. I think that's very true. That's true. I don't see any questions here in the chat. If nobody has any other questions, then we'll stop here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you joined us late, or there was a lot of information, it is being recorded, so we will be sending everybody a copy of the recording, so you will be able to see it in its entirety, because Steve did offer a wealth of information here. And I thank you, Steve, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Janice.
It was great. It was very helpful.
All right.
Thank you, Chip. Appreciate it. Thank all of you for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Okay, guys. I hope everybody got something out of it.
Definitely very beneficial. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Carolina. Take care, everybody.
Okay.